will be Dr. Lawrence Yusu Lee. Dr. Lawrence Yusu Lee is currently an associate professor in the Department of Applied Biology and Chemical Technology, Faculty of Science on Hong Kong PolyU. His research focused on development of new nanomaterials and nanocomposites for the applications in clean and renewable energy, including solar cell, water splitting, CO2 reduction, and batteries. The topic today is water electrolysis, a pathway to green hydrogen production. So Dr. Yoon Lee Lawrence, yeah, please.
Thank you for the nice introduction. And I especially have to thank the organizer for placing my talk at the last of today's. So actually my work has a lot of close relationship with the previous talk, especially Professor Hu, and also some of the work by Professor Xiao. So my title of the talk is Water Electrolysis. So I will talk about how to move on from the conventional fossil fuel type of energy source to the new hydrogen energy economy. So we have seen plenty of introduction about the problem of energy resources and also related environmental problems. Despite the huge effort so far, we can see that the major fuel actually we use is the coal and oil and gas, and also the major CO2 gas contribution is from these three types of fuels. We've seen a lot of problems. Is that the emission of CO2 is maintaining a certain level over 200 years, but then suddenly in last 50 years, it starts to increase rapidly, keep breaking the records. And now, because of that, we will encounter a lot of problems. One of the obvious problems is the global warming effect. So that increased temperature will also increase the average sea level. And also it can bring very severe heat waves, which happened mostly in Europe in last decade. So here I show that if we keep increase the global temperature like 2 degrees per year, then sooner or later, some of the cities that we love actually will sink under the sea. So there is a very imminent need to develop a new type of energy sources, and people talk about renewable energy sources. And because of their intermittent nature, we have to find a way to store them. And I think hydrogen can be a very potential new type of energy carrier for the future. As we've seen from Dr. An's presentation, hydrogen can be a fuel for the fuel cell, and it can be used for many different types of engines, and also it can be stored for the future use. At the same time, they can be a good chemical source to produce another type of products we need. And currently, the hydrogen is mostly produced by the steam reforming of the natural gas or the methane. And this is actually generating a lot of CO2 during the production of hydrogen. So this is a problem. The only reason we are using this method is this is most efficient and economically viable technique. There are some other so-called brown and blue hydrogen generation techniques, but they also produce CO2 gas. So this is actually against our initial goal to reduce the CO2 emission. So truly, an environmentally friendly way of generating the hydrogen is through the electrolysis by splitting the water. This water splitting reaction is composed of two half reactions: the hydrogen evolution reaction, where we actually generate hydrogen and store them or use them. And the other counterpart is the oxygen evolution reaction, which we haven't seen in a previous presentation of Dr. Hu or Professor Hu. In order to catalyze this reaction, we need catalysis. And most efficient catalyst the industry is using now is based on the noble metal. That's why if you look at the estimated price, this is so much higher compared with the steam reforming methods. Especially if you compare the HER and OER, oxygen evolution reaction is more difficult to achieve. This is more sluggish reaction involving more intermediate species. So if you look at the overall potential of water splitting, there's more contribution from the OER. So it is more demanding actually to make more efficient catalysis. We need more efficient OER catalysis. In order to decrease the price, of course, we have to use some earth-abundant metals. So this table shows some of the earth-abundant metals that are currently used for water electrolysis, and also shows their relative amount on the earth crust. So as you can see, the iron, we see the iron and the nickel, they are one of those abundant materials. And there are also molybdenum, manganese, cobalt. They're all quite plenty on the earth crust. So if we can use them and develop good catalysts, that will actually solve the problem of water splitting reaction. But as we saw in the previous presentation, these transition metals are usually located in the lower part of the volcano plot, both in hydrogen evolution reaction and oxygen evolution reaction. On the top, if you just look at the single metal species, they are usually occupied by the precious metals like platinum or palladium and species. So the goal is actually you tune these transition earth-abundant transition metals so that they can actually climb up of this volcano plot to the center of it. That means they are not really binding the intermediate too tightly or too loosely, so that they have optimum binding energies for the reaction, so they can efficiently catalyze the water splitting reaction. So throughout this talk, I will talk about mostly on the OER electrocatalysis based on the earth abundant elements. And I would like to share recent development in our lab, which involves morphology and composition control, and especially the interface and doping engineering. And we also studied some of the stabilities. So one of the first material that we were interested to pick two metal species that can combine or influence each other so that they can together go up to the top of the volcano plot is the metal organic frameworks. This one is actually made of metal nodes and the linkers, and they're open frameworks, and they have uniform dispersion of the single metal species. So they are actually used for combining two different metals like nickel, iron, or cobalt and nickel. They can be also used as a template, as we saw in the previous talk, to produce some carbon matrix containing metal atoms so that they can be used to produce single atom matrices. In our case, we wanted to use a MOF as it is electrocatalyst for OER. So what we did was we grew MOF in a 2D structure, and we chose cobalt and nickel, which located in the opposite side of the volcano plot. And then we try to control their ratio and then grow the 2D cobalt nickel MOFs. As you can see from the SEM and TEM images, we could able to grow very thin, quite uniform nanosheet array of this cobalt nickel MOF, which has about thickness of about 5.3 nanometers. And we use them as an OER electrocatalyst, but we can also treat them at high temperature under the ammonia, and we can actually turn them into nitride species, which has shown a good HER performance. But today I'm just going to focus on the MOF itself. This 2D cobalt nickel MOF exhibits the XRD peak very similar to its bulk counterpart, but the peak intensity is quite different. If you look at these peak positions, they are quite same, but one of the strongest peak is very reduced, and the small peak in the bulk species gets really strong. So this peak 220 has been really intensified, which actually occupies the side part of this nanosheet. And by comparing the relative peak intensities, we found out that this lattice along the z-axis has been contracted. And that was confirmed by conducting the in situ conducting AFM, which means we were applying the current while we are taking the AFM image. As you can see in this image, those edgy parts shows very bright color, which means there is a concentrated electron. So it actually transfer electron quite efficiently along this Z direction. Also, in the in situ focused ion beam microscopy, we first attached this single cobalt nickel MOF to the probes in 3 different configurations. First, along the Z-axis, X-axis, and diagonal. As you can see from this plot, when we connect them in a Z-axis direction, the current response is much higher than the other configuration, which confirms that the current flow has been facilitated to the Z direction, which should be the beneficial way because the reaction will occur on the top parts. So when we measure their OER properties, it shows that this cobalt one-to-one mixture shows much better performance than the single component MOF or different ratios with a better kinetics and conductivity. This when we did actually the stability test, or less than 10% decline after 30 hours was recorded, which is not too bad, but this raised a question about its stability. That's why we studied another set of experiment. If you think about the MOF structure and the catalytic reaction, the active site is either cobalt or nickel metal node, and in order for them to catalyze the OER reaction, the either the substrate or intermediate has to come and interact with this metal node, and that may weaken their initial bonding to the linker molecules. So we start to question about their stability. So instead of complicated 2-metal bimetallic MOF, we used another simpler type of MOF called the GIF67. This is another type of MOF made of cobalt and imidazolate. The cobalt, as you can see from this picture, it occupies it has tetrahedrally coordinate, and when we prepare the MOF, they give this nice cubic shape of crystal structures. And the reason why we chose is not only because it has only one metal, but they are known to be stable in electrolytes, and it's very easy to grow onto many different surfaces, including our electrode surfaces. So we first study their cyclic voltammetric stability. So we chose 3 different potential windows from up to 1.1, about 1 volt, to 1.3 and 1.5 volt, and we cycle them about 100 times. As you can see from these CVs, they are quite different. When we scan at lower potential window, we only see the capacitor-like behaviors. But when we started to increase potential to 1.3, we see some redox behaviors, which corresponds to the conversion of the cobalt-2 species to cobalt-3 species. One thing interesting is that the peak position as we scan is actually shifting. Initially, it occurs at a lower potential, but at some point, we start to see both of them. And in the end of this 100 cycle, they move to complete to the higher potentials, which indicate that there are two types of cobalt-2 species converting to two types of cobalt-3 species. When we increase the potential window to OER range, we actually see another peak corresponding to the cobalt-3 species converted to cobalt-4 species. And then this is the oxygen evolution reaction. By analyzing the anodic charge change over the cycling number, we identify these two types of cobalt-2 species, which we can confirm from the XPS spectroscopy. And what's more interesting is that when we evaluate their catalytic performance, the first species is dominant in the earlier cycling, has a much higher the turnover frequency compared to the second species that is dominant in the later part. So when we look at the overall catalytic efficiency, because there's a population is crossing over, when in the middle around 15th cycle, we saw the lowest over potential of about 205 millivolt. So in order to investigate what's really going on during this OER process, we also studied in situ spectroscopic techniques. The first thing is in situ UV-Vis. So we measure UV-Vis while we are doing the OER experiment. The second thing was, we already saw this experiment in a previous presentation. We also did operand or in situ Raman spectroscopy. So from the result, first from the UV-Vis, in the initial or at the low over potential, we still see the signature peaks from the MOF, GIF67. But you can see that with the increasing potential, their signature peak disappears quickly, which means they're getting destructed. Instead, we start to see alpha cobalt hydroxide species appearing, and then they are consumed. And then we start to see 3+ species, which is cobalt oxyhydroxide. A similar thing is observed in the in situ Raman spectra. Those GIF signature peak has disappeared at around 1.3 volt. Instead, we start to see the beta species, cobalt hydroxide, and also that converted to the cobalt oxyhydroxide. A very high peak until they catalyze the OER reaction. So we took the SEM image after two different cycle numbers. So after 15 cycle and 100 cycle for each 3 potential windows, as you can see, the initial cube shape has been already changed, something more like nanosheet arrays, even within the low potential windows. So that we interpreted that those GIFs that is in contact with electrosurface will go through interaction with the hydroxide species, and they actually change it to some other species. And that is more severe as you move on to higher potential windows. And if you go to the OER range, because of the oxygen bubbling, we can even see the cracks. The similar phenomena can be observed when we do the chronoamperometric experiment, which means we didn't cycle the potential. We only apply a certain potential and just hold it there for a long time. So here we hold the potential at 1, and here is about 1.5. We can see similar phase change, quite serious changes. So it's completely different species than we saw from the initial states. And we were able to identify some of the different species forming, making small domains. So based on these spectroscopic and microscopic images, we we believe that initial morph structure will change to either alpha species, alpha cobalt hydroxide, or they can be actually converted to the beta phase, and they have different activity for OER, but then they are the ones who were actually converted to the active species of cobalt hydroxide. So if anyone wants to use MOF for the directly for electrocatalytic reaction, probably you need to pay attention to their stability. I'm not saying the MOF is not a good electrocatalyst. They are maybe a good pre-catalyst that can be used to generate active species. But in terms of rational designing of electrocatalysts, it's quite difficult to predict what you will get from what you make. So with this, we quite pay attention a lot to how to improve the OER performance of the electrocatalysis. There are several ways we can expose more active sites or increase their conductivity or long-term stability. These things can be done with morphology controls, but we were more interested in how to modulate their intrinsic properties by controlling their electronic configuration of the active sites or their binding behaviors of the intermediate or the product. So for these studies, we mainly focus on two ways, doping and interface. So doping is introducing a foreign species with a different electronic properties so that they can control the mother structures. Or interface also bring in another type of species so that they have influenced each other so that you can change their properties eventually. So here comes our doping study, which has very similarity of the previous work. We worked actually on the beta nickel hydroxide species, quite similar to the LDH. The reason why we chose this is it's known that when you dope iron species to the nickel system, their OER property increases a lot. And we understood it because these two atoms are located on the opposite side of the volcano plot, so they can actually work to each other to optimize the bond strength of the intermediate species. And also, when you insert iron to the nickel species, their conductivity could be increased significantly. And we expect that there will be some partial electron transfer between iron and nickel species so that the active species can be more easily produced. Well, in one of the examples of using the iron doping to enhance the OER activity of nickel hydroxide species was done by Ku et al. And they reported this work. They tried to grow nickel hydroxide directly on the nickel substrate by wet chemical method, which is probably different from the previous Professor Hu's work. And then they tried to dope, and they only managed to dope up to maximum 1.5 atomic percent. So it was quite difficult to go over this. And yet the best OER activity came actually when they have only 0.5 atomic percentage. I believe this is not because this is really the optimal condition, but when they try to dope more iron species, this high concentration of iron actually produced a lot of protons, making the reaction condition very acidic. So that actually destabilized the grown nickel hydroxide species easily detached from the surface. So when you really want to do the OER, that is very poor because they are even come out of the surface. So with this idea, we try to maximize the iron doping to the nickel by using 1,4-phenylene diphosphoric acid as a kind of precursor species. So we also try to dope iron to the nickel hydroxide species without using the BDPA. As you can see, as you increase the iron species concentration from 0 to 0.1, this is less than 1 millimole. Actually, in this condition, when you use only 0.1, you can grow nice nano-array structures. But as soon as you increase further, you don't form these nice structures, but they becomes a chunk of big particles, and most of surfaces are bare. So they fail actually to grow or stick to the surface. So we use this organic molecule to in situ generate the iron BDPA precursor, which will actually slow down the release rate of iron so that it doesn't really make the reaction condition too acidic. So here we show that if you don't have enough iron concentration, actually you will form nickel BDPA species, so they will form quite different structures. But when we increase the iron concentration to even 10 or 20 millimole, they still form really nice nano-array structures. And when we calculate out the iron doping amount, this is only about 1 atomic percent. We were able to bring it to close to 10%. And when we look at them, the structure is quite disordered nickel hydroxide species, and we also saw a lot of micropores. And from the electron energy loss spectroscopy, we were able to confirm that there is a nickel oxygen and iron oxygen. We tested the OER performance. As you can see here, compared to the bare nickel hydroxide, when we have this disordered structure, the performance gets really good. I'm not so sure this is a new type of catalyst as Professor Hu introduced, or the classical catalyst. We didn't really go into the mechanistic studies at the atomic level. But anyhow, the over potential at 10 milliampere per centimeter square was quite impressive. It was only 194, below 200. And it shows very good, a very low Tape plot slope, which means it has very good kinetics and also the active sites. And even after 500 cycles, they were quite stable. We only used in situ Raman spectroscopy to understand what is actually going on. And we see that this nickel oxyhydroxide species, we didn't actually look for the iron oxyhydroxide species because we believe that that is still too little. And actually we couldn't identify from this peak. Maybe the nickel oxyhydroxide peak is too dominating. But anyhow, we saw that at quite early stage, at around 1.37 volt, we start to see the formation of nickel 3+ species. And also from the XPS, we can compare the before and post species. We can see that the nickel 2+ and nickel 3+ and also iron 2+ and 3+ ratio drops, gets smaller, which confirms the formation of high valent species. And in the oxygen species, we also see that after the OER experiment, the peak for the observed water species get higher and shifted, which means this surface has very hydrophilic nature, so that it can actually do better catalytic reactions. So this is the main finding. Without the BDPA precursor forming reagent, we couldn't use too much iron doping. Actually, we are forming nanoparticles. But with this, we can actually increase doping amount to the maximum, and that shows very good OER performance. So this is one of the studies we did for the doping effect. For the interfacing, we chose another type of material system, which is a PBA, Prussian blue analog. This is also similar to the MOFs. You can consider them as MOF analog. It also has a pore structure constructed with the metal ions. Usually it contains iron and other metal, and they are connected by the cyanide CN linkers, and they are used as a prominent electrode material and electrocatalyst. So we use the nickel iron PBA as a precursor to construct the controlled interface. First, we prepared the nickel molybdate, NMO, nanowires, and we grew the nickel iron PBAs on their surface by ion exchange reaction. And then subsequent calcination process actually produced the nickel iron oxide, nickel ferrite interfaced with the nickel molybdate species. So how do we control the interface? We control the growth of nickel ion PBA, which is the precursor for our catalyst. During the ionic exchange reaction, we control the content of the water. So we use the water ethanol mixed solution, and by increasing water content to from 25% to 75 and 100%, we were able to control their size of the crystalline PBA, which actually turned into a smaller size of the nickel of ferrite species. So as you can see in these TEM images, their size is quite different, and we analyze them as 11 to 51 and 70 nanometers. And they all have similar structures from the higher resolution TEM images. What's interesting is that when we use XPS to analyze their composition, the nickel to iron ratio is changing when we change their size. So this is a smaller, that means it actually has more nickel iron oxide species on the surface. So you may think maybe the larger particle may have more iron species, but actually they are smaller and they are more evenly distributed on the surface. So we can see more active material on the surface when we make them small size. Also, the nickel 2p XPS spectra shows that the nickel 2+ and 3+ species shows the positive shifts from the initial nickel molybdate species. And even the molybdenum also show this kind of same peak shift, which means that by forming the interface between these two, we actually make them interact quite strongly. The presence of the nickel 3 species suggests there's oxygen vacancy formation. So from this high resolution XPS spectroscopy data that compares 3 species, we can see that the nickel 3+ species is more on these smaller ones than the larger species. And also the oxygen defective sites are more on the smaller ones. So you can consider that the sample with the smallest catalyst size has the maximized nickel 3 species and oxygen defect sites. So with this, we compare their electrocatalytic OER performance. And as you can see from here, the smallest one shows the best performance compared with the 75 and the 100, which is a larger species. And of course, the bare nickel form or the nickel molybdate. And the overall potential was around 260. But good thing about this catalyst, we found that as we increase the current density, they're still very stable and their overall potential doesn't change much, which shows a good potential for real practical applications. We also studied the in situ Raman spectroscopy to understand what happens during this OER process. As you can see by comparing this pristine MO sample and this our sample, when we have this interface, the conversion of nickel oxyhydroxide species occurs at a lower potential compared to when you don't have this. So they actually contribute to the better OER performances. So we were able to tune the interface, the size of interface and the interaction between the two species. So successfully control their electronic interaction. As a result, we could achieve very good performance. The next question we had was whether we can combine these two effects together. So we were interested to have both effects, interface and the doping. And as a doping element, we chose a lanthanide species because the lanthanide is electron-rich species because of the empty 5d or 4f orbitals, and they show very rapid electron transfer. And there are many reports make use of this lanthanum or cerium or gadolinium. But actually, if you look at the ionic electronegativity, the samarium has very good electronegativity. So that's why we chose samarium as our dopant. And we used the exactly same system to control the doping and the interface at the same time. So in this case, we introduced samarium at the same time to form the interface of the PBA species, and then we calcinate to form them into samarium ferrite and samarium doped nickel ferrite species. So SF4 interfaced with samarium doped NF4. So the TM image shows that they are showing the sort of nanopyramid structure composed of two species. We actually found SF4 and samarium doped NF4 species. They are forming small domains. And these two these spacings corresponding to these two peaks of the XRD, which nicely corresponding to the inverse nickel ferrite structure. But if you compare the pristine NF4 with the samarium doped and interface NF4, you can see the peak ratio is quite different. Our main sample is actually following the standard peak ratio more precisely, which means they are more inverse spinel structure. Also, when we look at the Raman spectra, we saw that all the other peaks are occurring at the same peak, but then the A1G peak has been slightly shifted. This peak is largely dependent on the tetrahedral cation species, and this shift means that probably the samarium dopant has been entered this tetrahedral site so that the peak position has been moved. So before I go on further, I want to describe a little bit about the spinel structure of the nickel ferrite. If you have the normal spinel structure, normally the nickel occupies the tetrahedral sites, whereas the iron occupies the octahedral sites. When you completely inverse their ionic positioning, we shift all the nickel species into octahedral position, and half of the iron species will occupy the tetrahedral species. But in nature, you will not see this kind of perfect ideal inverse spinel, but it's a kind of mixed states. But the most active species for the OER catalysis comes from the octahedral species, which is known as very governed by the EG electron state that governs the binding strength of the OER intermediates. So what we want to do is we wanted to actually put more active species nickel onto octahedral species. In other words, we want to make more inverse structure. So we collaborate with a professor in Korea, and we found out that when you have the samarium dopant, they are more preferably go into the tetrahedral species, which is coincident with the Raman observation. And by doing this doping at the tetrahedral sites, actually it facilitates the transfer of the nickel octahedron site with iron octahedral site. So which means the reordering energy has been reduced. So it can help to push the nickel to occupy the nickel octahedral species. At the same time, the samarium doping can lower the oxygen vacant formation energy, so it can produce more oxygen vacant sites. So we did the XPS analysis. As you can see in this zoom area, we see the negative peak shifts of the iron species, whereas the samarium and nickel shows positive shifts, which means they are actually in a very strong electronic interaction. And also the oxygen spectroscopy shows the highly enhanced oxygen vacant site, defective sites. And from the OER performance, it shows very good performance with the over potential of 220. More important thing is we could actually bring the current density to 1 ampere, and it was quite stable over 100 hours. And we believe this is because we have both the interface and the doping effect. And from the in situ Raman, we also observed the similar effect that with our main sample, the transition to the active species occurs at a lower potential. And from the DFT calculation, we could rationalize that this is because when you have a more inverse structure induced by the samarium doping and interface construction, actually the oxygen 2p band has been upshifted, and that even changed their reaction mechanism. And then the overpotential is expected to be lowered. And that shows really impressive performance, even at the high current density and very good stability. The last part of my talk is actually we were interested to, so which one, interfacing or doping, which one is more important in terms of determining their property? So due to the time, I will quickly go over. So in order to understand which one contributes more to the improvement of OER activity, we chose nickel iron LDH, and we doped cerium in a different way. So by controlling the synthetic condition, we homogeneously doped the cerium to the nickel iron LDH, or we formed some sort of interface by forming the nickel hydroxide species. So as you can see, one type shows very nice interface with a cerium hydroxide species, but the other one is very still smooth surface with a nice layered structure. What we found from the XPS spectra is that there's a shift in opposite between the nickel and iron, and also there is a more increased species of the nickel 3 pluses when we have the interface, which explains that there is a very strong electron interaction between nickel and iron, which is induced by the interface cerium species. So from the electrochemical assessment, we saw better performance from the interface sample. And we analyzed that with in situ Raman, also we see that the conversion to the active species occurs at a lower potential. And from the DFT calculation, we also see that even the rate determining potential step has been shifted from the original position. So that explains much better performance of the interface sample. Actually, this is only applied to this nickel iron LDH with the cerium doping. Maybe in a different system, the interface or doping may work in a different way, but it's more, what we want to say here is that it's important to identify which contribution is coming from the either interface or the doping. So a bit rushed, but I hope that I kind of convinced that the importance of the developing earth abundant water splitting catalyst, and discussed some of the variety of materials but then there are still a lot of questions to be answered, especially about the structure-activity relationship to find out the true active species and their stability over the cycle. And even after all these things, there are other techniques has to be developed in other area like hydrogen storage if we are really going into the hydrogen economy. And there are also still a lot of different interesting material systems, especially those single atom catalysts. And you can also tune their property by introducing other nanocluster or other single atom or even the organic species. So there are a lot of room for us to work to make a more efficient catalyst. Of course, this work is done by my students. So I want to thank them, and also the collaboration with our colleagues in different departments, also support from the RISE. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lawrence Lee, for your very interesting presentation. Because of the time, I think we may allow some short questions, maybe 1 or 2 short questions. So if you have any questions, you can simply speak out, or you can type your question using chat. So any short questions for Professor Lawrence Lee? Or if you have questions later on, you can contact Professor Lawrence through email or other means later on. If no question at the moment, let's thank Professor Lawrence Lee again. Okay, so thank you all the speakers for this session, Professor An Liang, Professor Hu, and also Professor Lawrence Lee. So this is the end of this session. So thank you. And also thank all the audience for your patience, and thank you.